because I think it was just an area of personal interest and passion, but not because we necessarily thought we were going to do something right out of it. What ended up happening is through the course of researching the business plan, to create the business plan, we ended up having some companies ask us to create websites for them. So we did that. And then Time Warner came along with an opportunity for a project and asked us to do that. And we said yes. That ended up taking a fair amount of the summer. And so sort of one thing led to the next. And at that point, we decided to really see if we could turn it into a business. And sure enough, we built a website for the National Business Aircraft Association. And then we, sort of one thing led to the next. One of the folks who was on the Time Warner project ended up being one of the 4 folks who launched the New York Times on the web. And so a lot of the work came from word of mouth. And, it's sort of, I'd say we were enjoying it. So we kind of kept trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we grow it? How do we get more business? What do we do next?
So it kind of developed organically. How did you decide how to divide the labor? I mean, both of you wanted to be entrepreneurs, but there's so much to do when you co-found a company. What do you decide? How do you decide who does what? And were there a lot of arguments in the process?
So, at this point, we've been business partners for 25 years. And I think part of what has allowed that to work so well and be so successful is that, frankly, we were drawn to different areas of the business. Now, in the very beginning of the very first business, we actually decided who was going to do what. And the irony is, within the first few weeks, we ended up more or less migrating to different roles just out of personal interest. And then what's happened is those roles we migrated to are what we've kept up with now for 25 years. And so it's one of those things where I always tell folks, a business partnership requires a couple things for sure. And one of them is that you need to really trust each other's judgment, because if you don't, it's just not going to work. And the second is it really works much better when you have complementary skills. And, and if you both want to do the same things and no one wants to do the other things, that doesn't work very well. And so in this case, this was another piece that was just very fortuitous.
Okay, so the two of you formed 3 businesses in total, and Wayfair is the last one. But the first one was the one that you did when you were at Cornell, and it was about helping local businesses in Ithaca, creating a website for companies. How did that get resolved? Did you end up selling it? Did you end up folding it into something else?
So we ended up, right after we graduated, we moved to Boston. So we built the company up in Boston. We ended up growing it to about 40 people and in about just under 4 years. And at that point, we sold it. We sold it to a company called IXL. That was one of about a dozen companies that went public during kind of the .com years, 98, 99, 2000. And we stayed with IXL for a couple of years as it grew tremendously. And I'd say we learned a lot through that journey. We both had left IXL in 2000 and then sort of figured out what we wanted to do next. 2001, we tried to build a software company that ended up, it was interesting. The timing just wasn't right. The software product we built, it was too early for the market. We learned from that, but we decided to go back to the drawing board. And in 2002, March of 2002, is when we started Wayfair.
Okay, now before Wayfair became Wayfair, it was actually called CSN Stores, and it was really a network of different e-commerce websites. You guys launched this website initially in August of 2002. It was racksandstands.com, which sold speaker stands and TV stands. And by December of that year, it had about $250,000 in sales. Explain how you found your first customers at a time when it was still very early days for online marketing.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that allowed us to be successful is that we had the service mentality you need to have as a retailer, but we also had the technology and quantitative skills to basically make sure that the website was very functional, well designed, easy to navigate, easy for someone to navigate a large selection. But frankly, the other thing that mattered was that this was the early days of some of the forms of online advertising that we take for granted today. And so Google paid search, which at the time was called Google AdWords, and there was a competitor product on Yahoo called Overture. Those let you advertise against keywords, and you could track the traffic that came in. And so what we did is we basically would bid to get the traffic, and we could measure exactly what it was worth to us. And so where we would increase the bids or lower the bids, and that type of quantitative marketing, this was the early days of it, but that's effectively for the first number of years, that was sort of the vehicle by which we built the business in terms of how we would get folks to visit the website.
So you're constantly getting feedback on your different ideas and on the businesses. talk about how that folded into how you decided what domains to launch, because you launched other storefronts with unique domain names for everything from strollers to power drills to hot plates. And eventually, I think there are more than 200 of these e-commerce websites under the CSN umbrella, the network. Did you have a particular process or a checklist for deciding whether to launch a website for a particular product category?
The primary thing we did in the early years is our suppliers would tell us about other categories that were working well for them. We would then use the online search data where you could actually see the number of people searching any particular keyword to validate how big a market we thought it would be. And then we would look at the competitors to decide what do we think of our ability to compete. But effectively what ended up happening is we worked all our way through furniture over 3 years. Then we went through decor, we went through home improvement, we went through housewares, and effectively ended up building out all of these home categories. And along the way, we were opportunistic and added a few more in. And that's really when we moved to Wayfair, we got rid of the opportunistic ones. And we said, we're just going to focus on home.
What was the most unusual domain or unusual domain name that you had?
I think there was one, I'm hopefully get the name right. I think it was allroosterdecor.com.
All rooster decor? You mean like things that have pictures of roosters on them?
Correct. There's a tremendous amount in the decor space. That's one of the more popular themes. And now, mind you, it's a very narrow market. But we were launching small and broad category sites because one of the things you could find is that it could be a small category, but if customers really wanted it, it would feel like they'd found the perfect place.
And was this something that a supplier recommended, all rooster decor?
So what had happened is we had gotten to a point where we had built out a lot of categories. And at that point, we started to launch sites that could kind of cut across them. And so that was one of those. I'd say the vast majority of the sites were more along the lines of bedroomfurnituredirect.com or allbarstools.com, everyfaucet.com.
Okay, it's like an interdisciplinary major at college or something. You consolidated more than 200 sites under the new brand Wayfair eventually in 2011. What was the rationale behind deciding to consolidate the brand? Was there a specific moment?
Yeah, so starting in 2008, we had found that, hey, one of the large opportunities is that our customers are filling out surveys after buying from us, telling us that they really were very happy with us. They thought our service was excellent. That they would shop with us again. Now, the problem is they obviously didn't need a bar stool again, or they didn't need a faucet again anytime soon. So the question we asked is, well, are you aware that we have 250 other websites? And 70% said no. So what we did over a year and a half is we really tried to get a lot better at our email marketing and our other messaging to really explain, hey, we have these 250 other websites. And so if you really had a great experience with us for bar stools, you would for lighting, or you would for area rugs. And what we found through that is over the year and a half, we were able to double our repeat customer rate. And so we found that for customers who were paying attention, we could really get them to come back more and more often. They were making a lot of home goods purchases. The problem was that 70% that said they had not heard of us, a year and a half later, when we ran that same survey and we continued to run it, 70% continued to not be aware of us. And so what we really found was that if you really want everyone to know what you're doing, you really need to build a brand that people will find memorable and easy to understand. And that's what led us down the road of saying, hey, if we want to do this, we need to build a brand. And that ultimately a year later led to launching Wayfair.
Why Wayfair? What does the brand itself mean, or the name of the brand mean?
Well, today we hope it means that it's the place to go for everything home. When we launched it, it was we needed a short spellable term that did not have any particular connotations that we thought we could build up into being the ultimate home store. And so at the time, domain names have been being taken for many, many years. And so it wasn't that you could find just any term. You had to really create one. And here we basically found one that we really liked, that didn't violate anyone's trademarks, that we could get in all the countries that we operated in and wanted to operate in. And we thought we could build it up into being the ultimate home store.
Yeah, I ask because it doesn't necessarily signal that it's home decor or home furnishings or anything related to the home. And so it can be whatever you want it to be down the road if you decide to expand into something else.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, I think we're still only halfway to building it up to being understood as all things home. I think there's still a lot of our customers who love us, who think of us for furniture and decor. But they think about home improvement, whether it's doors and cabinet hardware, or lighting or plumbing or flooring and tile. They may not know that, hey, Wayfair is as strong in those as it is in furniture and decor, or same for housewares, And so I think you're right. You can build it up to mean more things over time. I think right now we're just very focused on it meaning home.
Okay, and there's plenty of work to be done on that front. Now, you said that you started CSN, which of course became Wayfair, during a time when e-commerce businesses were kind of out of fashion, and this was after the dot-com bubble burst. And this ended up being an advantage for you, Niraj, because there's space that created opportunity for you. Describe the competitive landscape at the time. What did it look like back then?
Yeah, so at the time in 2002, Amazon was already on the scene, but remember they started with books. They'd expanded into other categories. There are some categories I'd say they were getting known for, like electronics. There were still a lot of categories that perhaps they weren't known for. But by 2002, all the national retailers had opened up websites. So whether that was Walmart or Target or Home Depot or whomever. And so, that's led to some view that, hey, an online, an e-commerce company wouldn't have opportunity because you have to compete with national retailers. Our view, what we had found was that, hey, there are these niches that were not well served. And at the time, we didn't really have the full understanding, but over time we developed it, which was just that home is on one hand a very vast category. It's 10% of all retail sales. B2B and B2C is $400 billion in North America, $400 billion in Europe. So you have an $800 billion market we're going after. On the other hand, that's only 10% of all physical retail goods. And the challenge is home, there's not like a handful of companies in home. Everyone's in home. Target has a few aisles to the side. Walmart has some home items. Home Depot has some home items. There's decor specialists. There's places like Bed Bath & Beyond, Macy's. And then there's all the local players, furniture, lighting showrooms, plumbing showrooms. These are typically local players. And so we didn't realize this at the time, but what happened was that we started to fill in a white space, which is just that home is different enough that it creates the opportunity for someone to be the platform provider for home. And the fact that there wasn't one nationally because no one had been able to offer selection before was sort of what created just such a huge opening. And we sort of tiptoed our way into that without realizing entirely what the opportunity was. And then as we've seen it, we've continued to go after it.
So it sounds pretty fortuitous, but at the same time, a few years later, of course, you had to deal with the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis. And all of a sudden, all these homeowners who were stocking their newly purchased homes had to give up their homes. How did that affect your sales? And how did that affect what you were able to offer everyone?
Yeah, so that period, that 2008 to 2010 timeframe, over 3 years, at the time, about 3/4 of our business was furniture. And over 3 years, the furniture industry contracted from over $100 billion industry down to $70 billion. It was close to and the second worst after the Great Depression. So it was a pretty big contraction. What was interesting for us is that our business, other than the first few months where the business really slowed down, we grew through that period. And when we look back on, what happened, we came to realize is that customers were increasingly getting comfortable with online. And during periods of kind of severe dislocation, they're more willing to change their habits than they are during times when things are good. And so the fact that we had value, the fact that they could explore different price points and different selection that was available, these things were quite attractive to them when they were under the duress of the financial crisis, even more than they would be when times were good and they had plenty of money. And so that ended up creating an opportunity. And by growing through that period, a lot of our suppliers who had had challenges ended up realizing, man, e-commerce is a real opportunity because they grew through that period with us while some of their other customers contracted. And so I think what we learned from that was that this is just a long-term secular change that's underway. It's not a mature segment that's riding sort of, economic cycles.
You were able to find the people who are still willing to spend. They perhaps were just not spending in a more conspicuous way by going into stores and doing it, but we're doing it from the comfort of their home. If you were to start a business today and talking about that idea where there might be space and opportunity, is there an area where people might think it's out of fashion, a sector or a category that's out of fashion, but where you think there might actually be a lot of opportunity?
What I tell folks is, if you think about 1995 being the start of the commercial internet, you'd say, okay, we're 25 years in. And even though we're 25 years in, we might only be 20 or 30% of the way through the evolution. And the thing about it is the next 70 or 80% of the evolution will not take another 25 or 50 years. It'll take another 10 or 15 years because everyone's now carrying a smartphone. Everyone is accustomed to apps and internet solutions, and folks are willing to try new services if they're in fact convenient and provide value. And so what I tell entrepreneurs when they ask this question is just simply think about what services you use or pay attention to what services others use. and then think about what exists today in terms of ways that's being provided. And if you can do it in a way that's more convenient and better, customers will be willing to try it. And that's sort of the premise for a lot of businesses that are still viewed as relatively new, but are growing very quickly. Like, for example, during the pandemic, I'm sure we've all been ordering home delivery of meals. And if you look at the meal delivery services, that on one hand you say is a very simple service offering. On the other hand, it hasn't existed for that long. And so I think this is the type of thing you're going to see happen to every service and product offering that's out there.
Well, what about services like education or healthcare, which have been a lot more resistant to this kind of change that you're talking about?
Absolutely. So things like retail, which are low regulation, and they're going to be some of the first to get tackled. When you talk about healthcare and education, to a lesser degree financial services, those are still left to a high degree in front of us, partially because there's a lot of regulation in them, and partially because if you think about things like healthcare and education, there's deeply embedded ways that these things are provided today. It doesn't mean that customers are not interested in better solutions. It just means that it's more complicated and it'll take longer for the evolution to play out.
Is there an area you would avoid because it's too crowded?
I think the places that are the most crowded are where there's already effectively winners. I mentioned as an example, I was talking about meal delivery. I can't imagine that there's an angle to launch meal delivery today and be the winner, but perhaps you have an idea that would allow you to do that. So that's what you got to decide. Google was the last of the major search engines. There were quite a few that preceded it: Alta Vista, Lycos, Excite, At Home, Yahoo. There's a long list, yet Google was the big winner. They were the last one. So perhaps you have that type of breakthrough idea, but unless it's really a breakthrough idea that makes the service a lot better, I would say the crowded fields that have kind of entrenched scale folks are probably the hardest ones.
Okay, if you have a breakthrough idea, is it important to be passionate about it, to be obsessed with it, or is it more important to understand and be able to exploit the market dynamics? Because you have said that you and Steve Conine, your co-founder, weren't particularly passionate about home furnishings, home decor when you started CSN Stores.
I actually think that you really do need to be passionate about the idea. I think the challenge is that every idea, there's the good days and there's the tough days. And not everything is always easy and simple. And so that passion is what keeps you going when things are tougher. And I think if you just get into an idea because you think it's a good business idea or you think it's lucrative, I think the problem is that if it's a stretch where it's tough sledding, it becomes very hard for you to have the same degree of passion and excitement to keep moving.
Yeah. Well, one of your passions, I know, is to be able to work with your suppliers and to make things better for your suppliers. Talk a little bit about what you do to achieve that. I mean, how exactly do you make things better for your supplier?
So our suppliers are very accustomed to a traditional retail model where, frankly, they need to convince a retail store buyer to put their product on the floor and then offer it to customers. They don't have the ability to directly reach out to customers. And so one of the things that we think is really powerful about what we're providing suppliers is that all the energy they put into product design and into quality manufacturing, and they have a selection they think is incredibly right for the customer. We allow them to put that in front of the customer. And the fact that we're not in between them and the customer, but we're enabling it, puts them in a lot more control building their business. And suppliers like that because they're entrepreneurs too, and they want to be able to control their destiny. And they also see that the movement of volume is moving towards e-commerce. And so if they can be on an e-commerce platform that has volume, that provides things like the logistics that are the complicated pieces that they can't handle, but then enable them to put the product out there and reach the customer, that's a pretty exciting value proposition. And so we spend a lot of time just trying to make sure that suppliers understand all the tools that we have on our platform that they have the ability to use, that they don't need to ask someone for permission. They don't need to convince someone it's a good idea. They can actually get in there and start using those tools. And ultimately, customers are going to want to buy what's best for them. And so if the supplier is right and their item is the right fit for that customer, we want the customer to discover it and choose to buy it.
So basically, you're giving the suppliers instant feedback on a lot of their products and through the data that you accumulate based on what your customers are buying. What do they learn? What's the most interesting piece of information that your suppliers have learned from you through your customers?
I think some of the things around like what type of content and imagery matters to customers, understanding, the price points that demand falls at in a very granular way, things that they can then use when they either design products or choose how to merchandise them. A lot of our suppliers, they just tell us they've never had that type of information before, and all the work they've done in those areas has been blind to really understanding what people would react to.
Yeah, they're just kind of designing things on their own, thinking that this might be something the end customer will like, and then putting it out there, and hopefully someone goes and buys it. One thing that I've read is that you don't actually hold any inventory, Wayfair, and in fact, it's your suppliers who hold the inventory. Is that the case? And are there instances where it might be easier for you to hold inventory?
We've tried to set it up to be the best of both worlds. And by that, what I mean is that on one hand, we want to bring the full selection to bear for the customer. And so rather than us making choices and saying, oh, we'll buy this item, we won't buy that item, and we've effectively picked for the customer what's going to be available, we want every supplier to be able to lean in with all the products they want to offer. The only way tentatively to do that is for the suppliers to have to carry the inventory of what they want to offer. And so that's the reason we go with that model. It benefits the suppliers, it benefits the customers by making more selection available and creating more demand on the platform. Now, what we do to try to make it work easier from a practical standpoint is we do a couple things. One is once an item gains some traction, we provide the supplier demand data showing them what forecast we expect that item to have based on how it's performing on the platform, so they can have a point of view on the amount of inventory that they should carry. The second thing we do is we provide a logistics infrastructure. We have 18 million square feet of logistics. And what we do is whether it's ocean freight and drayage or the warehouses, we have 15 million square foot warehouses, a million square foot warehouse is 17 football fields worth of space. And these go up 30, 40, 50, 60 feet high. And then we do the home delivery operations. This allows suppliers to basically optimize their experience for customers without having to have all of the infrastructure themselves. And so we're trying to do kind of the best of both worlds, where we make it work very well for the suppliers, but we're also optimizing for the customer and allowing them to really get access to that world selection of goods to find the perfect item.
Got it. Okay, let's talk about this year, the pandemic, and what that's done for your business. When the economy was at its worst in March, when we went into this unexpected, sudden lockdown, you saw sales go up. At what point did you realize that the pandemic was going to be a boon, not just a boon, but a big boon for your business?
Yeah, so when the lockdown started in mid-March, we actually saw demand start to rise right away. At first, in sort of a set of categories, things that you would use for cooking, refrigerators, freezers, cookware, things that you'd use for having kids at home, kids' desks, kids' furniture, trampoline, swing sets, for things that you would use to work at home, desks, office chairs. And then fairly quickly, just in a matter of weeks, it started to broaden out to all of the home categories that we're in. And demand sort of kept rising. And then starting sometime in the spring or summer, started to taper some, but it still stayed at very elevated levels. So I would say that we saw the demand pretty much right away. What was hard to predict, given the nature of a pandemic, the lack of other situations that resembled it, is we couldn't tell what would be a spike versus what would be continued demand. And we also couldn't tell how the economy was going to fare. Didn't know what type of stimulus was going to be there, didn't know what sort of economic support was going to be there. And so the fear wasn't so much that we weren't seeing a demand spike. The fear was just around the durability of it and what was to happen next.
So at what point did you realize that the demand was sustainable, that it's going to last, that it was going to be more than just a spike?
I would say that seeing the economy stabilize. So unemployment sort of took off, but then you saw it sort of get better, and you saw the economy fundamentally stabilize, with the exception of certain sectors that have been hit very hard, in terms of tourism and hospitality, entertainment. But outside of those sectors, you've seen broad-based stability, and you've seen that, so the job loss, which had gotten very bad, has started to get better. And it's still at an elevated level, but it's actually showing signs of healing. And so that then has given us a view that what's happening is more durable. You're also seeing households saving more money. And so the parts of their discretionary income that have been freed up, they've been able to save. And so what they're using for home goods is out of a bucket that still has the net saving more. And what you see is that, unfortunately, the pandemic has a kind of a have and have nots. And so we're talking about folks who have jobs and have excess income. There's a lot of folks who basically didn't have any excess income, didn't necessarily have a lot of savings, and where the jobs have either been eliminated or curtailed. And those are folks who are having a really tough time. And I think the pandemic, unfortunately, has not treated everyone equally. And that's the challenge. We all need to figure out how to make that better.
Yeah, although the federal government did try to address that with the stimulus that they passed, the several rounds of stimulus. How directly did you feel the effects of the stimulus when it first passed and then later on when it lapsed and it was not renewed?
What I would say is the stimulus, which was the checks that were directly sent to households, the $1,200, that had a stimulative effect for sure. You see a spike that's relatively short in nature. You see something like that every year when people get their tax returns. This was more significant than that, but it's similar. In terms of the other stimulus that the government has passed, whether it's the PPP loans or whether it is extending unemployment benefits through the end of July in terms of increasing the amounts, a lot of those items I don't think necessarily show up in what we've seen for demand, because those are basically funds that I think folks use for kind of core necessities, food, shelter, rent payments, keeping their business afloat, things of that sort. And so I think, it's hard for us to get a read on those items.
Okay, that's interesting. So if there is another round of stimulus, it might not be something that you see have a direct effect on your sales in the months to come, because it will go to the core basics: gasoline for your car, food for your refrigerator. To what extent were you prepared for the surge in growth that you saw in the spring? Is there a way to prepare that kind of unexpected sharp growth?
What I would say is, on one standpoint, I would say there's no way to prepare. On the other hand, I would say what did prepare us is that we've been public for 6 years. In 2014, when we went public in the fall of 2014, that year, our direct retail sales was about $1.1 billion. And this year, we're on track. I forget what the exact analyst consensus is, but it's somewhere in the $13-14 billion range. And so over 6 years, that growth, last year we did over $9 billion. That growth has been a CAGR of 40% per year. And so we're accustomed to growing quickly. That said, this demand shock, which was very significant, that we weren't ready for. And so I'm just proud of our team. I think everyone rallied and did a tremendous job, whether that is in customer service, where we had the same number of people the day before as the day after, and yet demand has spiked. And now we have folks working from home trying to make that work, whether that's in our 65 logistics operations, where we've overnight implementing, social distancing and different cleaning and safety protocols. So it's, everyone made it work. And I think our team did a great job, but it's very hard to be fully prepared.
Yeah, well, everyone had to make it work. And of course, companies had to spend a lot of money in ways that they might not have planned for. And like other companies, Wayfair raised money in the early spring as well. In early April, you raised about $535 million from investors led by private equity firms, which I thought was interesting. Why did you decide to go down that road instead of selling corporate bonds at a time when the Federal Reserve was backstopping the credit market and making it easy for companies to do that?
Yeah. So at the time, as I mentioned, demand had grown, but we didn't know what the sustainability of that was. And while on one hand we had a bunch of cash on the balance sheet, if you ran real shock scenarios, we said, well, geez, we would prefer to be better capitalized than we are now. I would say that our financial profile we had at that point in time, with the overhang, I don't think that we could have accessed traditional debt in an easy and fast manner. And our view was that if we're going to raise money, we want to do that quite quickly, because frankly, waiting is not a good move, because if you end up needing the capital, you won't be able to get it. And so what we did is just over the span of 2 weeks, we raised capital, and we raised it at quite good prices relative to where we were then. And it was effectively what we thought of as a very expensive insurance policy. But because our prospects were so bright, it just seemed unwise to at all carry any risk on not having a strong enough balance sheet.
Yeah, so it sounded like you were being cautious and doing what you could at the time. When I look at Wayfair's share price, it's up about 15 times from the low in March. Do you think investors got things wrong back in March? We still don't have the COVID-19 under control in any way, shape, or form. The new case count is surging, and we haven't even hit the deepest part of winter yet, or even fall for that matter. What do the sales trends that you're seeing across Wayfair tell you about how things are going to shake out, or how grim things could be? Is there a way to get a read on that?
Yeah, so it's very hard to get a read on, what's happening broadly. What I will say is, demand for home goods remains strong. And specifically, I think on Wayfair, we've had a set of long investors who've really studied the business and understand how well we're going to do when you look out over 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so I think our share price today doesn't even fully bake all that in if you compare our gross profit multiple to other consumer tech companies that have done well. But this will be proven out over time. I think what we saw in March is certainly the stock market's reaction, I think, positing that perhaps we would go out of business, which of course we didn't ever believe. But I think that you see these types of reactions in extreme circumstances.
Right. I want to talk about something that happened over the summer, because there was this period where your employees walked out to protest the sale of about $200,000 worth of beds to a nonprofit government contractor that operates shelters for migrant children along the U.S.'s southwestern border. Explain to us what happened there and how you addressed it.
Yeah, so that was a year and a half ago. So that was the summer before this last one. And what happened was that we had a group of employees who did not like the immigration policies of the government, and so what ended up happening was they sort of wanted to protest something that was not Wayfair specific, which was the broad-based policies, but they sort of focused in on the fact that we were providing beds to the shelter. I don't think they fully understood that it was even a nonprofit shelter. Our view is that we have a great group of employees, and there's a wide variety of diverse opinions out there. The way we thought about it is, hey, we need to have a forum for internal discussion where folks can share their views. But at the same time, Wayfair as a business is going to support a wide range of customers. And so we basically internally got a group together and we discussed it. And I would say that that's yet another step that's gone really well for us, where we have a very tight-knit group of employees. And I think they want to be a participant in the company. They want to be a participant in society. And that enthusiasm, we try to encourage it and hope they channel it into positive things.
And in the end, I think you donated $100,000 to the American Red Cross as well. There was a lot of criticism that Wayfair's response was a little bit wishy-washy. Employees, some unnamed employees, said that you weren't trying to commit to anything too specifically. Why not take more of a firm stance? I think of Microsoft, for instance, which took a stand to a similar protest by not going to withhold technology from institutions that, according to Satya Nadella, we've elected in our democracies. Ultimately, may not have been something that employees agreed with, but it was a straightforward and transparent response that quelled the matter and didn't lead to a walkout.
Well, what I would say, we're a relatively young company compared to Microsoft. And so in that sense, I think we're continuing to learn how to create all the internal forums for discussion. This particular situation you're referring to led to one of those. In fact, the policy that team came up with, I thought was a very good one, which is basically the policy is we're not going to sell to hate groups. And there's a specific definition of what that is. But it also recognizes that's a wide variety of people who are our customers, a wide variety of organizations, and we don't necessarily expect every individual to agree with every one of them. So I think we similarly have points of view, and it's just a matter of creating the forums internally for the conversation. And this is one that we've since created.
Yeah, I mean, it's growing pains of any new company. And you're right in pointing out that Microsoft has been around a lot longer and dealt with bigger, more existential issues, including the whole antitrust lawsuit by the government. Now, we talked about how that happened a summer ago, not this past summer, but this summer, Wayfair was the target of a conspiracy theory that claimed some of your products were being used for child trafficking and that you actually resigned from the company. Clearly, this didn't happen. You're still with the company. You didn't resign. How did you address that story, and what did that experience teach you?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a few things we noticed. So one, you have a baseless conspiracy theory that is being debunked by any legitimate media outlet, and yet is getting carried on social media. Started on Reddit and getting spread on TikTok and Twitter. And it just kind of shows you that the kind of focus on making sure that there's honesty in what's being shared and spread is an important thing that needs to happen. And the way it's done today is not that accurate. I would say on what happened there is that one, at least there was great clarity in what was accurate. That Wayfair had nothing to do with this baseless conspiracy theory, that it was basically groups that are not out for the truth, not out for the better interest. And we're seeing, I think, moves where you're seeing that the kind of modern day media outlets are finding that they need to worry about the honesty of communication more and more.
Yeah, well, given the political environment and how the election unfolded,
Evolving and large challenge for any company.
all right, let's talk a little bit about how your business is going right now in the current environment where the economy is open, but in a modified way. You've said that you prefer to have people working in the office, working together face to face, as opposed to remotely. What does Wayfair's operations look like right now? What percentage of your employees are working from home? Who's able to go into the office?
Yeah, so I'd say the vast majority of our corporate staff and customer service groups are working from home. When the pandemic started, they all moved to work from home. We've been able to open up some of our office space in a very limited capacity way. And even when we've done that, we've seen a very small portion of the folks choose to go in. So I would say virtually all of those two groups are working from home. And our supply chain and logistics teams are working in the logistics operations. So we have both things underway in the business. We think collaboration is really critical and important. We've been very happy with how we've been able to do that over video conferencing and other types of messaging and other collaborative applications during the pandemic while everyone's working in different places. That said, what we're hearing from folks is that they miss the office as well. And so I think when we get to a future normal, I think we're gonna have to figure out what the right balance is to allow folks flexibility while making sure that we preserve what the company needs for collaboration, innovation, creativity, communication. And so I think there'll be changes from what we did before. And I think, frankly, it'll be a little hard to figure out exactly what they are until we get to the future normal.
And I know this is a question that no one can really answer right now, but if you had to put a timeline on when things might get to the other side of the pandemic, what are you thinking about? Like, how are you planning for that?
Well, we've told all those teams that we do not expect. The earliest we would tell folks that, hey, we kind of want everyone to be back in the office would be basically next June, and that's a date we pushed back from January. So when it started, we said, okay, well, we know it's not until Labor Day, and then we said we know it's not until January. Now we said we know it's not until June. I think a lot of this, we're just seeing how this is playing out in real time. 2 vaccines have been announced with great early results. We'll see how the final results come in. Then there's a period of time for the first round of them. Then there's a couple months until there's a wider round available. So there's a bit of a trajectory, and some of that's out of the control of companies like ours. And so what we'll see is how this plays out. But I'm optimistic by the time we get into something in the later part of next year, we're seeing things have returned to a much more normal state.
And Niraj, you are a director at the Boston Federal Reserve, which is one of the 12 regional Fed banks. And the Boston Fed's been very vocal this year about the need to solve the public health crisis around COVID-19 in order to solve the bigger economic crisis. I wonder how you've advised the Boston Fed based on what you've seen at Wayfair.
Well, so my tenure on the board of the Fed ended at the end of last year. So I'm not been on the board this year, just for clarity. But I would share the view that you just shared, that ending the pandemic is critical to really helping the economy broadly fully get going, and to help a lot of disadvantaged folks who are struggling get going.
Poor research on my part. My apologies. Let's talk a little bit here about Cornell, because we usually have people who are based in New York joining us for Cornell Tech at Bloomberg. You, of course, have the Cornell connection, and you are on the Cornell Tech Council, which is the school's equivalent of the board. Give us your observations on how the school has adapted to the pandemic.
I think the school has done a great job adapting to the pandemic. And, to be honest, I think, if you think about Cornell Tech, it's really a very progressive, forward-looking school. When you look at the areas, the subject matters of study, and you look at what it's focusing on, it's research and academic training oriented around the future and the fields that will matter in the future. And so that's part of why I'm so excited to be contributing.
You're based in Boston. It's not Silicon Valley. It's not New York, which I think the term is Silicon Alley. What's unique about starting a startup in a city like Boston? Because you don't have the big banks around you like you would in New York. You don't have the built-in tech community like you would in California.
Yeah. So what's nice about Boston is you have, on one hand, kind of a great town. So it's a town that's very livable, and full of a variety of industries, great folks. Then it has some, it has 2 of the top 10 universities in the world. It has 100 colleges and universities in the metro area. It's got world-class healthcare institutions. It's a world leader in biotech. So it has a lot of industries that are very prominent. And then if you look at the technology, it's broad-based. So it's not just biotech. It's not just robotics. It's not just audio. It's not just internet. It's not just B2B software. But you see leaders across all of those segments. And I think that's why when you look over the last decade, after Silicon Valley, Boston's had the second most successful series of tech outcomes. And I think it's just something that's not as well known about Boston because it's not a city as large as New York. But when you look specifically at tech success stories, Boston actually is number 2 after the Valley. And so that combination, I think, makes it a great place to both live and build a business. And that's why I've really enjoyed being here.
What about when it comes to recruiting for talent? Is it easier to get people to stay in Boston? You talked about the university scene there. And is it easier to get MIT graduates, for instance, to stay in Boston as opposed to going off to sunny California?
Yeah, so we recruit on campus at a lot of colleges and universities, a number of which are in the Boston metro area, a number of which aren't. And I would say we have pretty good success with Boston being a very attractive place for folks. We also recruit nationally for jobs. And what we find is that we can get folks to relocate to Boston because it's such a great town to raise a family in. Some of the other cities like New York, you end up with either incredibly high costs or incredibly long commutes. And so some of the advantages Boston can offer have helped substantially.
You think that changes, though, with the pandemic and people falling out of love with cities?
I think a lot, it's yet to be seen how that's going to play out. I'm pretty bullish that urban centers will continue to do well, but obviously we're in the middle of an upheaval, so we're going to have to let that play out a little longer.
Yeah, don't want to commit to an answer there just yet. Niraj, what businesses or entrepreneurs do you admire, do you respect?
Yeah, so I would say that, one of the things I've noticed are the companies that have had a focused strategy and then have stuck with it and sort of done incredibly well by compounding things over a long period of time while staying true to their basics. And so if you look at Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and what they did with Berkshire Hathaway and how over a very long period of time they've been able to continue to grow that business, kind of sticking to the core ideals they've always had. Or earlier you mentioned Microsoft. Microsoft is a tech company that's had to reinvent itself a number of times, but has done that and has continued to be a leader. I mean, there's different companies that are just incredibly impressive in how they've sort of stuck to what they know, but not ever let up or given up. And I think those are the companies I first think of.
Yeah, going with the classics there. Are there any companies or people that you've lost respect for over time?
I think obviously different things happen and things come and go, but I tend to, the companies I tend to admire the most are the ones, I really like the ones who actually show the long-term nature of outcomes. And so I tend not to get too wound up with things that come up too quickly or go down too quickly.
Okay, looking for longevity there. All right. Niraj Shah, I want to now open up our discussion because we do have questions and answers, or answers from you, questions from a couple of Cornell Tech students. And we may be virtual, but this is something that we do normally. And hopefully the technology will cooperate again. I'm going to call up Saul Kadir to see if he's available and can ask Niraj a question. Saul?
Hey, how's it going, Niraj? Thanks for taking the time.
Happy to do it, Saul.
Cool. So one thing that really resonated me in your story is specifically your founding story with Steve Conine is how you both you met summer before Cornell, were engineering students. And I kind of find myself in a situation or a similar situation with Dean, who's also asking a question on this call, where we're both CS students here at Cornell Tech. We met the summer before classes started and are both working on a venture through Product Studio. And I would love to hear a bit more about your founding story, specifically like what areas you guys both focused on in the early days and how you sort of portrayed your roles as a founding team to outside people.
Yeah, so I would say, really for us, when we started our first business, we were excited about the potential of where it could go. We were excited about the potential of the internet. That first year, we probably ended up working, 90, 100-hour weeks. It was one of those things where it was just incredibly busy all the time. That's not something that I think is necessarily durable forever, but for us and for the beginning of the business, that's what it needed to get going. And we were willing to do that. And so I would say in terms of how folks outside thought of us, our friends knew what we were doing. They thought that was, interesting. I would say it was very non-traditional. We didn't have a lot of friends who were pursuing entrepreneurial ventures. Most folks were either in graduate school or pursuing more traditional type jobs. But, I think it wasn't particularly viewed as something crazy, but it wasn't very common at all.
All right, let's also call up Dean Zimberg. Sol mentioned that Dean had a question. Dean, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. So it seems that success, especially in hindsight, comes in part from being in the right place at the right time. In your early career life, I'm sure you're faced with many opportunities, doors that would open and close at certain times, such as deciding between grad school or moving forward with your startup. How did you choose when to walk through or not walk through certain doors of opportunity? Further, did you have a feeling of serendipity or happenstance when you met your co-founder?
Yeah, so Steve and I were good friends. And so in that sense, the idea of starting something with a friend is very, very comfortable. In terms of the decisions, like, not attending graduate school, honestly, none of those ever felt that difficult because, like, for example, that one, the way I looked at it as well, I'm really excited about the opportunity with this business. And if it doesn't work out, I can always go back to school. And so it wasn't so much that you were making a permanent decision, but you were rather making a decision of what you were going to do then. And I think that's an important point to consider because, there's a handful of decisions that are permanent, but most decisions are more about the next leg of the journey. And I think trying to make the wise ones there matter.
If you were to go back to school, if you were your 16, 17-year-old self, or even in college, is there anything that you would have studied knowing what you know about starting a business today? I think I would have, for example, I find economics fascinating. It's part of what I enjoyed about the role on the Boston Fed board. I would have taken more economics courses in school if I had the credits available for that. At the same time, I really enjoyed being an engineering student. I think engineering is an incredible foundational training for all types of things in life, and including being an entrepreneur. So I think there's just trade-offs. I've been happy with what I've chosen. Yeah, it's worked out pretty well for you. Niraj Shah, thank you so much. Niraj Shah is co-founder and CEO of Wayfair. Now, finally, I want to hand things over to Cornell Tech Dean Greg Morissette to provide our closing remarks. Greg is the Jack and Rilla Nisi Dean, and he's a Vice Provost of Cornell Tech. He is also a faculty member of the Computer Science Department at Cornell University. Greg?
Thank you so much, Scarlet, and thank you for a wonderful interview. Niraj, I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. And I'd also like to thank Cornell Tech's co-hosts for the Cornell Tech at Bloomberg series, Bloomberg and Tech NYC. Hi, everybody. I just want to say a few words about Cornell Tech itself. As you know, it's Cornell University's new campus here in New York City, focused on technology research, education, and innovation. We're bringing together the best minds in computer science, engineering, along with business law and design to build a better world. And this December marks the 10-year anniversary since the city of New York at first announced the Applied Sciences competition, which led to the establishment of Cornell Tech. And it was an effort at the time to shore up the city's economic health and long-term competitiveness and galvanize and rethink technology research and education, not just for New York City, but the entire nation and the world. Today, we have a state-of-the-art campus here on Roosevelt Island with about 350 master's students, 90 PhD students, dozens of faculty and staff, and more than 70 startups have been founded out of our academic community over that time that we've been operating. Most of them are based right here in New York City, and we're very proud of that fact. New York will never be known for just one industry, which is what makes this city unique and a great place for innovation. Over the last 10 years, Cornell Tech has played a big part in establishing NYC as a destination in tech. As we look to the next 10 years, our campus is focused not just on helping the tech industry flourish, but ensuring that tech has a positive impact on our lives. We need responsibility and consideration for the societal impact of the technology and the products we're building. And we need real strategies to broaden participation in tech education and industry at all levels. At Cornell Tech, we're taking this head on, especially with New York City now in a new era of crisis, with new focuses and programs like urban tech to improve the lives of people living in cities, immersive health tech to apply the full measure of modern computer science and engineering to improve healthcare outcomes, costs, and accessibility, and public interest tech to catalyze and amplify technical advances that promote societal welfare and address systematically unfulfilled needs. We're focusing on the most pressing issues facing technology, industry, society, and policy today, including AI, machine learning, security and privacy, and more. Our researchers, students, and faculty are doing things like creating privacy tools for survivors of domestic violence, building apps to detect opioid overdose by monitoring respiration, fighting deep fakes on the internet, and so much more. The focus on social impact is even more important as we enter into a new era. For years, the digital world has thrived and has given way to a new cyber meets physical revolution. And we're engaged deeply on how technology impacts society at large, from job creation to matters of personal privacy. And we're connected on the local level in New York City to ensure that we can have a positive impact on the world and on the city we call home. I'm so glad you all had a chance to hear from Niraj, because he's one of the newest members of our Cornell Tech Council, a group of top industry leaders who provide their advice and guidance to our campus and to ensure that Cornell Tech is engaging the tech ecosystem in the ways that matter most. Core to our mission is a focus on bridging the gap between academia and industry and connecting experts across disciplines to learn, research, and work together in a collaborative and open environment. We believe that bringing people with diverse expertise and backgrounds together is what makes better leaders, better research, better products, and companies for the future. At Cornell Tech, a community has emerged where new perspectives are shared, questions are asked, and ideas are challenged. Opportunities like this Tech at Bloomberg series allow us to maintain an open dialogue between our students and campus community, as well as industry leaders and entrepreneurs who are tackling real-world issues and connecting them back to academia. Those real-world connections are core to the experience here at Cornell Tech. For anyone who wants to learn more about the campus, to collaborate with our academic community, or enroll in one of our incredible interdisciplinary master's programs, I invite you to visit tech.cornell.edu. We're right in the middle of admission season, so the timing is perfect to join an info session to learn more about what makes Cornell Tech, the whole Cornell Tech experience so unique. And you can email admissions@tech.cornell.edu for details. Thanks so much for coming.